Hello, everyone, and welcome to this preview of the 2024 state legislative sessions hosted by the Center on Technology Policy at UNC Chapel Hill. My name is Matt Peralt, and I'm the center's director. Today, we're going to look at the state of state tech policy. We've got three main goals for this conversation. First, we're going to provide a snapshot of what happened in states in 2023. Then we're going to provide some guesses, hopefully accurate predictions about what will happen in 2024. And then we're going to provide some analysis about what makes state policy different. If you're covering this industry, what do you need to understand about state policy in order to do this work well? We've got three experts to help us navigate state tech issues today. Kara Bunder, the State Policy Director for the Computer and Communications Industry Association, Austin Jenkins, a staff writer for Pluribus News, and Scott Babwa-Brennan, the head of online expression policy at our Center on Technology Policy. Here's our plan for the conversation. We're going to turn to chat amongst us for about 30 minutes, and then we'll move to Q&A at about 12:30. If you have questions, you can use the Q&A function at any point in the discussion, or you can raise your digital hand once we get to that portion of the discussion. And then we're going to aim to end promptly at 12:45. So let's jump in. Kara, starting with you, what were your key takeaways for state policy in 2023?
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for having me on this panel today. I'll try to keep this brief considering there was a lot of activity last year among the states. I would say that some of the main takeaways that I had from last year is that data privacy continues to be a topic top of mind for state lawmakers. I would say prior to last year, we saw only 5 states that had comprehensive laws on the books. And those were largely in blue states. That was in California, Colorado, Connecticut, Utah, and Virginia. But then last year, we saw a wave of other laws being ushered in, and that tended to be largely amongst traditionally red states. So we saw states like Indiana and Iowa, Montana, Tennessee, and Texas adding laws to the books as well. But we did also see Delaware and Oregon, in the so to say blue state realm, enact laws as well. I would also say that content moderation continues to be a topic of mind as well. This did seem to make a little bit of a shift from, so to say, traditional approaches we saw, which prior to last year were largely focused on whether digital platforms should be required to host all and most material, or whether digital platforms should be taking down more material. And I think that transition largely went to conversations fully focused on harmful material that's been defined in a variety of different ways, or maybe not defined at all, and protections for children online.
Scott, how did you see it? What were the key takeaways from the 2023 state legislative sessions?
Sure. So I'm going to start with something like ridiculously obvious, which is legislation passed, which is actually somewhat novel, right? So we counted something like 65 bills passed across the states. But it's notable, right? Because the federal government passed none, like no new bills last year. And it just underscores, right, like how much is happening at the states, how the states have really become the leading force in tech policy. So in addition to privacy, states were super active in child safety. I want to say there's something like 23 bills across 15 states. And we saw states kind of unlike privacy taking kind of a set of different approaches, instituting new age verification requirements for social media, new age verification requirements for adult content, restricting what minors can do online, giving parents new rights, doing things with schools. And of course, in child safety, we also saw a ton happening in terms of litigation, with major cases being brought, for example, like the FTC's case, or excuse me, like the state AG's case against Meta. And then the other, I think, big area that we saw was AI, which is like the big story, right? Like in really just like the big story in general was AI, but states really rushed in to do something here. But rather than passing sort of major comprehensive reform, we saw states passing more what we call in a report last month, kind of these learning bills focused on establishing task forces or working groups, or funding new research or government audits to sort of gather information to sort of setting the stage for action down the line.
So Austin, you're a reporter at Pluribus News. The tagline for the organization is 50 states, one source. So you're looking across 50 states. looking at tech policy issues across the states. From your vantage point as a reporter, what did you see as the key issues in 2023?
Well, I think we've mostly hit them, and they are absolutely big trending topics: data privacy, social media regulation, the sort of general idea of trying to make the internet safer for youth, AI, which is really ramping up this year. I'll just mention a couple of other things that jump out at me. One was just that, there's some one-off legislation that's notable and interesting. Montana, the state of Montana, the legislature there banned TikTok from within its borders. Now, of course, a judge has block that from taking effect. There's lots of questions about whether that's A, enforceable, and B, constitutional, but it sort of speaks to the climate that I think we're in, and also the politics of that particular state, and the fact that social media companies in particular seem to be in the crosshairs of state legislators on both sides of the aisle, frankly. One other topic that I'll mention that certainly gets into the tech realm is that right to repair bills really started to gain traction in 2023. And I think we're going to continue to see that trend. California passed a bill, Minnesota, it's on the books now in New York. So that idea of, and what's interesting is some of the tech companies that have historically been opposed to right to repair and allowing independent operators, independent repair shops to have access to some of the tools, it is starting to loosen or relax, or they're starting to back off of that historic opposition, which I think is also kind of an interesting trend line to be watching.
So all you guys are mentioning legislation that has actually been enacted into law, which, as Scott said, differentiates it from what's happening at the federal level, where there are lots of debates, there are hearings, there are bills introduced, but at the state level, bills are actually becoming law. So maybe we could go in reverse order, Austin, starting with you. What's the rationale for that? What's different about what's happening at the state level?
Well, it's so stark, this contrast of, Congress just seems like it's so gridlocked, nothing's happening. There's a lot of talk, a lot of hearings, but no real yardage down the field, so to speak. And then you turn around and you start looking at state houses, and they're passing bills day, nights, weekends, holidays. They get down to business. Most of them have fairly short or at least limited sessions. They're not operating year round. And so it's, the starting gun goes off and they're off to the races. And what I keep hearing from state legislators, it's almost like the tagline, I don't even have to prompt them, is, well, Congress isn't acting, so we need to. Congress should be doing this, but they're not, so we're going to step in. And I'll go one step further, which is, it almost seems as if state legislators are starting to freelance governing, how to govern when Congress isn't functioning. And I'll give you a specific example. This last fall, there was an informal working group of 60 plus lawmakers from across the country, Democrats and Republicans, red states and blue states, meeting to talk about how to regulate and manage and learn about AI. This is sort of an ad hoc, group just saying, we're on the front lines here. We got to do this. Probably better to coordinate and have a conversation before we all go off to do our own things. And I keep thinking, the line I keep repeating is like, this is a great thesis or focus area for a PhD political science candidate, because it really seems like state legislators are trying to figure out some novel and new ways to essentially do federal legislation at a state level.
Interesting. So I think there definitely seems to be an ethos now that you need some policymaker in the United States to regulate. And if it's not going to be happening in Washington, then states see it as their as a role that they can play to lead on some of these issues. Scott, is that what you see as the primary driving force, or are there other issues as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge part of it, but I think there's also a structural reason as well. And this is something we really focus on in the report. It's single party control. It's trifecta control, right? So last year, 39 states had trifecta governments, right, where one party controls the governor's seat and both houses of Congress. That means that in those states, it's much easier for one party to actually pass legislation. When you combine that with the fact that most states don't have filibusters, again, making it that much easier to pass legislation, it just makes it a lot easier, right, for states to get things actually enacted, unlike the federal government, right, which of course last year, right, we had a split government. So I think that structural reason really, really is sort of key here to understanding why states can actually get things done.
Kara, what about you? What do you think?
I honestly don't have too much to add because I think both Austin and Scott covered everything that I think is contributing to the states being, so to say, more nimble in being able to pass legislation. But I think, that trifecta dynamic is absolutely critical to what we're seeing in states being able to move bills across the line. And I also do think, and Austin touched upon this, the fact that they are meeting in a much more condensed manner and not full-time legislatures, that once they are in session, they have this drive to get things done and then are able to do so because of that party alignment within the states.
One discussion that Scott and I have repeatedly that I'd love to have a little bit here amongst the four of us is the role of lobbying at the state level and what role that plays. Someone asked us after we had produced our report, did we do advanced statistical analysis and use regression analysis to try to isolate various different variables that factor into what might drive states' ability to enact policy into law? There are obviously lots of variables, and the answer to that person's question is no, we didn't do advanced statistical analysis to isolate those variables. So I know it's hard to isolate one, including lobbying, and really identify the role that it plays, but I think lots of people speculate that that's really the driving force of what happens and what doesn't at the international level, at the federal level, and at the state level. So Austin, maybe starting with you, since you cover it from a reporter standpoint, like, is there something distinct about lobbying at a state level that makes it a driver of legislation getting enacted into law or a barrier to states passing certain types of laws?
A couple of things I'd say about that. One is, especially with part-time legislators, I do think that can amplify the role and the power of the lobbyists. If they've been around the state house for years and years and years, and they do this on a full-time basis, and they're dealing with part-time citizen legislators, they're often the subject matter experts, and they can leverage that. Secondly, they're there mostly to stop things they don't like. It's easier to stop things, in a legislative process, sausage making process, than it is to get things across the finish line. So that's where they can often be most effective. They can also be very effective in getting down into the weeds, helping to rewrite legislation, helping to write it out of the gates if it's something they like, and then if it's something they don't like, or they can live, they could maybe get to supporting it. If there were some changes, they can actually draft amendments and work with sponsors. So there's a lot of fingers in the pie, and lobbyists are playing a really significant role in the ecosystems and state houses, and that should not be ignored. That said, one observation I have about the social media regulation in particular is that there is something in the water right now where legislators seem very motivated and very compelled to act, and seem to be sort of saying, to heck with the tech industry and to the tech companies, and if they sue us, fine, bring it on. I suppose they're hearing it from their constituents. They are parents themselves, and they're concerned about the impacts to their children. But there's a lot of lobbying happening around that. But what I'm not clear about is how effective that is right now, because it seems like there's been this tipping point, and legislators, again, across party lines, seem very motivated right now to try to do something specifically around social media.
Kara, you guys do state level advocacy and you do federal level advocacy. I'm curious if in those advocacy efforts, if you see something about the efficacy at the state level that's distinct from at the federal level.
Yeah, I think I can comment on the fact that, it is challenging, especially, I'm located in Washington, D.C. and not in each one of these state capitals. So there is a challenge to having the advocacy, resonate with folks who, as Austin mentioned, are really, focused on what their constituents are concerned about. And there does seem to be this swing to being concerned specifically about regulating social media. So one, there's a challenge in keeping track of everything that's going on across the 50 states, but also being able to make those connections and being able to understand what's going on the ground, because there are also a lot of local forces at play there. And I would need to consult with my federal counterparts because I am fully diving into what's going on across the 50 states. But I imagine that there's probably, having that concentration here in the district and being able to walk up to the Hill and talk with folks does have a little bit of a different barrier to entry and being able to impact those conversations.
Scott, how do you see it, even in the absence of advanced regression analysis?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like we go back and forth on this issue of lobbying. I mean, I think from the outside, this is something that gets a lot of attention, right? A lot of people, when they talk about state policy, they really focus on the role. They imagine that companies have a huge impact. Some of the state legislators that we've talked to, they will also say that companies have a big impact on what bills go and which ones don't. But I think Austin's point is absolutely right, that the only thing that sort of makes sense is that we can't take all topics as equal, right? That like in some areas, I see very little evidence that state or that lobbyists are getting much done, like actually having much of an effect. In other areas, absolutely. So I think we really have to take this on a sort of like issue by issue or case by case sort of basis to understand really the role that lobbyists are playing here.
So let's dig in now, if we can, to some of the specific issues that were front and center at in-state capitals in the last session. So maybe we could start with privacy, Kara, which is where you started in your opening comments. This was the debate a couple years ago. California is setting the bar, setting the standard in privacy law. And I think the concern from industry was that if other states follow California's lead, then we're going to have a patchwork of state laws. Patchwork was kind of the mantra over and over again. We don't want privacy law to be a 50-state issue. It should be governed federally, which makes more sense for users and for industry. I'd love to take stock now a couple years later at where things stand and how we look at this, because what we've seen is a series of state laws passed, not rooted in the California model, but in the Washington Privacy Act model. So in the report that Scott and I published, we found that 12 of the 13 states that now have comprehensive privacy laws on the books follow this Washington Privacy Act model. So Kara, maybe starting with you, like given where we were and where we are, how do you assess the state of state privacy law now?
Sure, I think that's a great question. And I think, I don't know if this needs to be stated, but of course, because the federal government has not yet enacted a comprehensive consumer data privacy legislation, there was a push to potentially almost have a patchwork. I think from an industry perspective, it's been great to see that that's not the approach that has been taken. I think it's also worth noting that California's privacy law the regulations are still not fully established. So even though they were the first state to come out with a data privacy law, they are still the ones working through trying to figure out what that ultimately ends up looking like. With there being so many states now that have data privacy laws that are following that Washington model, starting to wonder if that's going to tip the scales in that we're just going to accept that it is going to be a state-driven data privacy law model. And, from our standpoint, we're trying to push to make sure that even as states are continuing to debate this, that those definitions adhere to what's already on the books to encourage and facilitate interoperability and to not dive down what a potential true patchwork of very diverging laws across the states might look like. And I think so far those conversations have been going decently well because lawmakers are able to point to now a growing number of states that haven't really had a huge amount of rough debate on this topic because it's already established elsewhere.
Scott, how do you read where we are now relative to the debate from a couple years ago?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, right, we've seen this de facto national standard sort of emerge, and it would be really interesting to see sort of how the federal government too sort of responds. I mean, I could see it going one of two ways, right? I could just see that basically every state or most every state eventually ends up passing some version of this bill. I could also see the federal government saying, well, let's just go ahead and sort of codify this, it's take up the kind of key provisions here. Yeah, and I think to really kind of look more closely at what the WPA style bill does, it's sort of a compromise bill. It's not often kind of framed that way, but it is something that has a lot of industry support because it doesn't include a private right of action, because it doesn't include universal opt-ins. It has universal it has an opt-outs. But at the same time, it does move the ball forward in a meaningful way. It does establish important new rights for consumers about how they deal with about their data. It does, I think, maybe even most importantly now, given what's going on with AI, a lot of these bills establish new kind of protections for genetic or biometric privacy, but excuse me, data. So yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of part of it too. That it's a bill that kind of all people can, that a lot of different groups can kind of get behind, if not love.
Mm-hmm. Austin, patchwork or interoperable de facto national privacy standard?
Probably the latter, but what's interesting also is that when I'm in Washington State, the irony, of course, is the Washington Privacy Act never actually passed here. So it became the model for other states, not in effect here. But it can be sort of accordioned or adjusted for the state. And so states are using the basic template, but some of the laws that have passed, and in particular, Kara mentioned, more red states were passing the comprehensive data privacy bills in 2023. Some of those, you look at Iowa's bill, for instance, it's more, you could argue it's more business friendly and less consumer protective, still within that framework. And then a state like Connecticut would be viewed perhaps as more consumer protective. So depending on the politics of the state, you can take that and apply it, sort of as works for your state. Now, I will say that consumer and privacy advocates feel like this model is too business friendly and not protective enough. That's the common refrain you hear from Consumer Reports and others. They're not terribly comfortable with this in the grand scheme of things. They're kind of concerned that this is going to get so well entrenched that then it becomes a model for Congress. As Scott mentioned, it doesn't have the private right of action. I mean, that was the big point of contention here in Washington State. What's interesting is I just wrote a story about what's happening in Maine, where a new model started to emerge. And it was a hair on fire moment for industry because it looked like Maine might be heading down a new path and doing something different that would disrupt this Washington Privacy Act train moving down the track. So I would just note that I think that's something to watch for. Is New Jersey was the 13th state as of this week. Governor Murphy has signed their law into effect. We expect more states to act in the coming year, New England states in particular. But one thing to think about and to watch for is what if a new or different model starts to emerge? And then how does that start to change the conversation and the lobbying?
So let's move to the crystal ball portion of the discussion, at least on privacy. What do you think is going to happen in 2024? Like, are we going to continue to see the march of the Washington Privacy Act model in more states, or will that slow, or will there be, I get the point that we should be watching for the emergence of a new model. So a slightly different question to say, is that likely? Do you think if we're here in a year, we would be talking about a state that has passed a new model?
I think I'll jump in just briefly and say, it sounds to me like the Maine bill, M-A-I-N-E, the bill in the state of Maine, is now essentially been rewritten or redlined, and it now more adheres to the Washington Privacy Act model, but there are some elements of it that would be more protective and sort of might take things in a new direction. I think the thing I'll be watching for is, does that hold and take hold in Maine? And if so, then do other New England states in particular start to look to, perhaps a more robust, from a privacy standpoint or consumer standpoint, model that still is sort of WPA based, but has a new flavor to it. I think that's what I'll be watching for. And I would expect other states generally in 2024 to continue adopting comprehensive data privacy laws.
So Kara, would love your thoughts on the same issue. So do you see the Maine model, does that move us in a patchwork direction, or with the changes, is it more part of an interoperable system?
I think it'll be interesting to see where it ends up. I know that they've been debating it heavily, even in the past couple of weeks, and there's been a lot of, local organizations and industries that have been weighing in it. I mean, notably LL Bean, which I think is not one that we necessarily had on our bingo card to be so active on the data privacy front. But I think, to their point earlier about local voices really probably being the ones to have the most impact on lobbying efforts, particularly in the states, I think that's really critical to watch. So from my standpoint, I'm interested to see how those local groups are going to end up weighing on this, because again, I think they're going to be the ones that ultimately have the biggest hand in shaping what the Maine law looks like. Not sure. I need to take a deeper dive into what those actual provisions end up looking like. But when we talk about the patchwork, I think the Northeast in particular is an interesting case study, especially given the condensed nature of the just geographic region and also the movement of people in between states. I think there's an argument to be made that, especially since there's so much movement across state borders, that it would behoove New England states to have more alignment with their data privacy laws so that consumers also have a better understanding of what their rights are moving across those state borders.
And when you gaze into the crystal ball for 2024, what do you see?
I do see, if I could have a very accurate crystal ball, I would hope that it would include, more movement towards having the WPA adopted across states, again, just to encourage the harmonization and interoperability across state borders.
And could I
Scott?
just jump in with this? I think that we should go one layer deeper here, and I'll just note that what is most interesting, there's several things about what was being proposed in Maine that we don't have time to sort of go into, but one very specific thing is the data minimization standard. The way that they were crafting, and it appears there's still language, the last version I looked at, would be much more restrictive to companies about the data they collect at the front end, and essentially saying only collect that which you need to provide the service that the consumer is asking for in that moment. That language that Maine is considering is tighter or prescriptive than what we saw, for instance, emerge from Connecticut. So that data minimization part is really the thing to be watching for in the next couple of months.
Mm-hmm. Scott, what are you seeing looking ahead to 2024 in privacy?
Yeah, to take things out in a slightly different direction. So we've pretty much just focused on these comprehensive privacy bills, but also the states this past year were pretty active in kind of more issue-specific privacy bills as well. So we saw a couple states pass what would have been called like comprehensive health privacy bills. I think Washington, right?
Washington State,
yeah,
My Health, My Data.
Yeah, exactly. Like that was the the kind of major one there. That grouped that included a bunch of provisions around health data, but also genetic and biometric. And then we saw some states do just genetic or just biometric. There's been a sort of like low hum of these sorts of bills as far as like genetic and biometric. I think that's definitely going to continue. There definitely seems to be some momentum around the health data privacy. So I wouldn't be at all surprised to see some other states pass kind of similar bills to the what we saw in Washington.
We'll move to Q&A in a couple minutes. So if you have questions, please send them in to using the Q&A function, or after this next round of questions, I'll open it up if you want to raise your hand. So maybe we could talk a little bit about child safety. I think in some regards, the past year was a year of child safety at the state level. Why was that the case, Scott?
I don't know. I mean, it feels like the topic right along with AI. Like there's been for several years now, right? We've had tons of press coverage about the growing concerns about the various harms that digital platforms might be posing to children, right? We've seen kind of growing academic literature, which is somewhat unclear, but seems to be pointing in the sort of direction that there are harms that we need to be concerned about, right? Prominent whistleblowers like Frances Haugen, perhaps most notably, raising the alarm about these sort of harms. But also I think like it's an issue that both parties kind of can agree that like something needs to happen. What exactly that something is and what the exact problem that they're trying to solve, I think they disagree on. But there just seems to be a lot of sort of it seems to be in the air, right? It's that something needs to happen in child safety. So I think that's what's driving a lot of this.
Kara, we're seeing a bunch of the bills that have been passed at the state level, maybe not a bunch, but a handful, approaching a handful of the legislation that's passed at the state level get blocked, at least on a preliminary basis, in court, primarily on First Amendment grounds. What should we make of that, and what does that mean for what we think states might do in 2024?
Yeah, I think that's really important to look at that. One of the things that I would say with a number of these laws being litigated is that I think it really hammers home the fact that this is a really complex policy issue. And while I think everybody can agree on ensuring, children have a safe experience online that avoids risks, I think it's equally hard to argue against the fact that a lot of these approaches do raise legitimate concerns about data privacy, especially talking about the ones that would have age verification. I mean, any services that would need to engage in that process would almost certainly need to collect additional data. And do folks really want to create a, so to say, honeypot of information that then could be exploited, especially when it pertains to younger users? And you already mentioned this, but they're also being held up because of First Amendment concerns. And again, I think it's hard to argue against adding additional protections and safeguards online. However, it is also difficult to say that there's an argument for addressing one perceived issue by creating a host of additional other issues that are really impactful to particularly vulnerable populations online. By cutting off access to information or communities of support, those risk creating other issues. And again, those could be targeted to either, children who are in abusive households, children who are not able to access communities of support in their physical location. And so I think that's why there needs to be a more nuanced approach to addressing these safeguards, rather than taking this, so to say, blunt approach that risks creating other issues.
So I think Scott and Kara, you guys have articulated what is challenging here for state policymakers. Scott, you've articulated the interests that policymakers have in addressing parental concerns, and Kara, you're showcasing why it's been challenging for them to actually effectuate lawmaking in this area. Austin, if we can turn to you, I'm curious, with your ear to the ground in 50 state capitals, how you're seeing state lawmakers reconcile these two things, where clearly there's an interest in taking action here, but the track record is a fraught one, it seems like, in terms of how courts are responding to what states are doing.
It is. So you have, Utah, for instance, which passed the first parental permission bill for social media, now kind of retooling. And so they're going to delay, it looks like, the implementation to later this year and do essentially a repeal and replace and try to come up with something that might be more durable. So that's one sort of practical response, right? You get sued, your law is threatened, go back to the drawing board. There's also a level of defiance that I'm hearing, and I think I alluded to this earlier, that some lawmakers are saying, we're going to do what we're going to do, and if the industry wants to sue to try to stop it, bring it on. We'll see in court. And then the age-appropriate design code model, which is less specific to social media and more broadly says to an entity that's likely to have youth visiting their platform or their product or their site, look, you need to design it with the best interests of kids in mind. That law passed in California, model legislation. It's been blocked now. And the advocates are retooling that and then going to try again in several states this year. So modifying the model bill and trying again to get it passed, but not letting the litigation stop them in the tracks.
Mm-hmm. So we'll move. We got one question through the Q&A function. We'll move to that. If others have additional questions, please ask them. So we got a question. What else is interesting in the main bill? Austin, it sounds like you're close to that one. What else do you find interesting about it?
With the caveat that this is a moving target, there's actually two bills, one from a House Democrat, one from a Senate Republican. The House Democrat did have a private right of action in her bill, so that allows consumers, not just the Attorney General, to enforce through litigation. The other element that I know is getting a lot of attention is a prohibition on third-party targeted advertising, and that would be a potentially significant disruption of current digital advertising models. So again, how much of this ends up in the final bill and in the final analysis remains to be seen, but there are definitely elements, especially of the House bill, that seem to go significantly further than what we've seen pass even in other Democratic-led states.
Kara, Scott, you guys have anything to add on the main bill? Okay, I would love to get your thoughts on the craft of state policy work, because it seems to me, being relatively new to it, that it's a different beast than some of the other type of policy engagement. And you guys each, I think, do this work exceptionally well in a world that's really difficult. Like there aren't that many news organizations that try to cover what's going on in 50 state capitals from a looking holistically at that across the 50 states, and Pluribus News tries to do that. Kara, the same for you at CCIA and tracking what happens at the state level. And at our center, we're trying to keep tabs on it for the annual reports that we do. So maybe Austin, starting for you, there are many media organizations that focus on national policy or exclusively the policy of one state, but very few that focus on state policy nationally. You look across all 50 states, that seems different. And from my perspective, daunting. What are the strategies that you use to do the work that you do?
Yeah. Well, I think a starting point is that there's great State House reporting being done by on the ground State House reporters across the country. Now, having been one here in Washington State prior to my work with Pluribus News, I also know that it's a dwindling number of people. So as the issues are getting more complex, as populations are growing, there's fewer reporters doing the work, the yeoman's work of covering state houses. We're very mindful of the fact that that work needs to be amplified. And where we think we can really add value is by connecting the dots, seeing the emerging trends and patterns, picking up on what's sort of burbling up or emanating from the states, and then bringing that together and making some sense of it. You know, we often say a lot of states are the laboratories of democracy. That feels more and more true. And I also think that the overturning of Roe v. Wade in many ways snapped the attention of the American public to the role of state houses, because then what we started to see is abortion rights and abortion laws being at a state by state basis. You know, that became very real very quickly. Well, in any number of topics and areas, that's happening every day, every year in these state houses. And, you know, I feel like as a longtime state house reporter, you're often shouting into the wind saying, pay attention to what's happening in your state capital and not the inaction in Congress. But I sense that the winds are shifting and people are starting to realize, look, a lot is happening. It has a direct impact on business. It has a direct impact on the individual lives of citizens. And we really see at Pluribus an opportunity to add value here. And in this moment, to be laser focused on covering the states and identifying these emerging trends and spotting stuff early. What my boss, Reed Wilson, will often say is healthcare reform started in the states, moved to Congress. Welfare reform started in the states, moved to the federal level. The issues that are being debated in state houses today are going to be debated in more state houses next year and the year after, and are going to be on the front doorstep of Congress in a few years. And the only thing that I think has really changed in that kind of the realm is there's a lot of issues that were on the front doorsteps of Congress. They didn't act, and now states are doing.
Kara, can you give us a glimpse into your day-to-day? So you guys track a bunch of these issues, you collate and surface them for people in different ways through briefs that you write, and you do a series of maps that help people to understand what's going on in different states. Again, it feels daunting to be looking across so many different policymaking venues and trying to keep tabs on them and make sense of them. Can you give us a sense of what the day-to-day work looks and feels like for you?
Sure. So I have to say that when I originally moved to DC, I thought I was going to work in federal policy. That's not the direction my career moved. But dating myself, and I'm thankful that there are now tools that help facilitate the ability to track legislation across all 50 states. But when I first started working in state policy, had to go to each state's website and pull the introduction list for each day manually. Thankfully, that is not the case anymore. There are technology tools that allow you to through subscriptions and able.
Can you actually mention them just for
yes,
if there are people? Yeah.
So some of the ones that are well known are Bloomberg Government Quorum, Fiscal Note. There are also other companies that will do tracking of legislation for you, so that that's not part of your day-to-day. But we do work with Quorum, and so we're able to use a series of search alerts that will give us the legislation that, or at least an idea of the legislation that's out there, and then we can wade through the ones that are relevant or irrelevant, and then tag them for the various issue areas that we're we're tracking. But we're also able to drill down into a more granular level about some of the key provisions that we're watching in each of those states. For example, private rights of action, or whether it's attorney general enforcement, and then be able to organize ourselves and move down the line that way. Again, it would not be that easy if it was still back in the day of having to pull individual introduction lists and then scrub all of them by trying to infer what a short title might mean. But it's become much easier with the use of those types of tools. That being said, it's still a lot to wade through, but it definitely makes it easier.
Scott, how about from your perspective? When you and I started doing this work a couple of years ago, we were largely new to state policy. What's been most striking to you about it?
Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard. Just covering 50 states, but also state policy is so, I don't know what the word is. It's so driven by personality and personal relationship. It's backroom, so much happens because of like who knows who and what one particular person is really into, that it just makes it really hard to like really know. We mostly like focus on looking backward and giving a broad synthetic account, but to do the work of like actually predicting and giving a really good prediction of like these are the specific states where privacy is actually going to go next year, it's really really difficult. So I have a huge amount of respect for people who can do that, do it and do it well.
So let's double down on that. We have 3 minutes left. Maybe we can just go around to each of you and say, if we do this again in exactly a year, and we're talking about the biggest thing in state tech policy that happened last year, in 2024, in the sessions ahead, what will that thing be? Does anybody want to go first?
I'd say, okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Austin. I would say it'll be interesting to see how the conversations about AI turn out this year. I think it's especially interesting given the fact that it is an election year. And I'd say that some of the pieces of legislation that we're already seeing pop up, and we're only in the second week of January, have been expressly focused on that. I think there's a concern, again, especially because it is election year, whether some of those AI generated images or videos might contribute to either mis or disinformation surrounding candidates. And so I think that will be very interesting to see and reflect upon at the end of next year.
And could we even push into that a little bit more? Like there seems to be a sort of a fork there. There are the kind of bills that Scott and I discuss as like studying and learning type bills of doing studies and gathering data and government coordination. And then there is sort of more direct regulation of the technology, like deceptive practices bills in advertising, for instance, or creation of federal agencies or I guess state agencies to regulate AI specifically. Do you see more states going in one direction or the other?
I would say they're kind of all over the map. I think we're still seeing task force and study bills coming up. I think we're seeing the ones that are specific to election deepfakes. There are some related to AI generated CSAM. There are ones related to AI in decision making, and particularly with regard to discrimination. So I think it's more of a fork than it is, a multi. I don't want to use prong because that gets us back to the fork analogy, but a multimodal way that states may go when it comes to AI. I would say that one of the challenges that we're seeing is trying to talk with lawmakers about what exactly with regard to AI they're trying to legislate or regulate, because we saw this really grow out of the large language models, but of course we've been using artificial intelligence for a variety of things for much longer than the existence of the LLMs. So I think step one, and when we're talking with lawmakers, is like, okay, which part of this are we actually trying to cut off and regulate and figure out how to move from there.
Austin, what do you think the biggest story of 2024 will be?
I wholeheartedly agree, AI, and I would think we should be watching for some new models to emerge, not unlike what we've seen with privacy. I think that there's some interest in at least getting some interoperability and some common definitions, and then states may go off again and do kind of their own thing. I'm also watching to see if are there states that try to tackle more comprehensive AI regulation versus those narrower slices, for instance, focused on the deep fakes? Can expect to continue to see legislation around social media and kids. As I mentioned, this another attempt at trying to pass the age appropriate design code bill in a few states, which is a broader approach to try to regulate the internet as it relates to how kids are interacting with it. And then just also, it's always important to be aware of wildcard issues because there's more than 7,000 state legislators around the country. They all have ideas for what they want to do. I just wrote a story that we published this morning about efforts in Colorado and Minnesota to regulate around brainwave privacy, neural networks. You put on a device, it can start to read your mind. I mean, this sounds sci-fi like, but it's actually starting to be reality. Some interest now in regulating that. So in Colorado, it's amending the Colorado Privacy Act to include this specific area of privacy. So I always like to be surprised by the issue that we don't even know is going to emerge and then does and becomes super interesting.
Scott, biggest headline in 2024?
I'd have to totally agree about AI, but I guess I would also add, child safety, piggybacking on what Austin said. I think we're going to continue to see a sort of a number of different sort of approaches in child safety kind of pursued. We'll see there's a ton of action happening and age verification for adult content like we're seeing in North Carolina, and then the pushback on that I think is going to be super interesting. I think the other kind of big area that we're going to see is going to really depend on just which way the courts rule. So I feel like we're waiting on some really important Supreme Court decisions on the Florida and Texas content moderation bills. I think depending on how, if the Supreme Court upholds that model of state legislation, I think we'll see a lot of those sorts of bills, especially heading into an election, and that will be a huge story. So we'll have to see though which way the court rules.
Good note to end on. Austin, Kara, Scott, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us. It's great.
Thanks everyone else for tuning in.